Coraline. Hi movie review lovers friends. Today I am going to describe the movie story of Coraline. Now let's talk about it. As we know that Coraline is a 2009 American stop-motion animated dark fantasy horror film written and directed by Henry Selick, based on the 2002 novella by Neil Gaiman. The first feature film produced by Laika Studios, it features the voices of Dakota Fanning, Terry Hatcher, Jennifer Saunders, Dawn French, and Ian McShane. The film tells the story of a young girl discovering an idealized alternate universe behind a secret door in her new home, unaware that it contains something dark and sinister. As Gaiman was finishing his novella, he met Selick and invited him to make a film adaptation, as Gaiman was a fan of Selick's other stop-motion works. When Selick thought that a direct adaptation would lead to maybe a 47-minute movie, the story was expanded. Looking for a design different from that of most animation, Selick discovered the work of Japanese illustrator Tadahiro Yasuji and invited him to become the concept artist. Yasuji's biggest influences were on the color palette, which was muted in the real world and more colorful in the alternate universe. Production of the animation took place at a warehouse in Hillsboro, Oregon. Coraline premiered at the Portland International Film Festival on February 5, 2009, and was released theatrically in the United States on February 6 by Focus Features. The film was met with widespread acclaim from critics and grossed $126 million on its initial release. Several theatrical re-releases raised its box office total to $186 million, making it the third highest-grossing stop-motion film of all time. The film won Annie Awards for Best Music, Best Character Design, and Best Production Design, and was nominated for Best Animated Feature at the Academy Awards and the Golden Globes. 11-year-old Coraline Jones and her parents, Charlie and Mel, moved from Pontiac, Michigan, into the Pink Palace Apartments, an old Victorian house in Ashland, Oregon. While searching for an old well, she meets a black cat and the landlady's grandson Wyborn Wyvie Lovat, who gives her a rag doll that eerily resembles her. Since her parents are busy with work, Coraline entertains herself by exploring the house, discovering a small door with a brick wall behind it in the living room. That night, she opens the door and finds that the brick wall has been replaced by a tunnel, which leads her to an other world, where button-eyed doppelgangers of her parents lavish her with delicious food and their attention. Upon waking in the morning, Coraline finds herself back in the real world, where Wyvie recounts that his great-aunt disappeared when she was a child. Coraline then meets her neighbors, Sergei Alexander Bobensky, an eccentric Chernobyl liquidator-turned-gymnast who owns a mouse circus, and retired burlesque actresses April Spank and Miriam Forcible, who warn her of impending danger in her future regarding the other world. Coraline returns to the other world that night, where she meets Wyvie's mute doppelganger. When she returns yet again, the cat, who can travel between the worlds and is capable of speech, arrives and warns her about the other world. The other mother offers for Coraline to stay in the other world forever, on the condition of having buttons sewn onto her eyes. Horrified, Coraline desperately tries to return home, but she remains in the other world. When Coraline tries to escape through the door, the other mother imprisons her in a dark room behind a mirror. There, 3 ghost children, one of whom Coraline recognizes as Wyvie's great-aunt, tell Coraline that the other mother is an evil entity called the Beldam, who used rag dolls to spy on their unhappy lives and lure them into the other world. They allowed her to sew buttons over their eyes, and she subsequently robbed them of their souls. After Coraline promises to help the ghost children by retrieving their eyes, the other Wyvie helps her escape through the passageway home. Back in the real world, Wyvie asks Coraline to return the doll, since it belonged to his great-aunt. She attempts to explain the situation to him, but he disbelieves her and runs out in fear. Coraline receives an adder stone from Spink and Forcible and, after the cat informs her that the Beldam has kidnapped her parents, the duo set out to rescue them. Knowing that the Beldam has a penchant for games, Coraline proposes a deal. If she finds her parents and the eyes of the ghost children, the Beldam will let them all go. If not, she will stay and accept the Beldam's offer. As Coraline finds and collects each of the missing eyes using the outer stone, she frees the spirits of the ghost children and the other world begins to fade until all three are collected and the entire dimension, except for the living room, eventually disintegrates. The beldam, now in her true arachnid-like form, challenges Coraline to find her parents. Realizing they are trapped in a nearby snow globe and that the beldam will not honor her end of the deal, she throws the cat to distract her before seizing the snow globe and narrowly escaping through the door with the ghost children's help, amputating one of the beldam's hands in the process. Coraline's parents return with no recollection of their capture, and she warmly embraces them. Later, the ghosts warn Coraline that the beldam is still after the door's key. As Coraline heads toward the well to dispose of it, the beldam's amputated hand sneaks into the real world and attempts to drag her back to the other world. Wybie, having realized Coraline was telling the truth, comes to the rescue and vanquishes the hand before they both throw it and the key down the well. The next day, the Jones family hosts a garden party for the Pink Palace residents. Wybie brings his grandmother to the party and Coraline begins to tell her about her missing sister's fate. Voice cast: Dakota Fanning as Coraline Jones, Terry Hatcher as Melinda Mel Jones and the beldam alias the other mother, Jennifer Saunders as April Spink and her other-world counterpart, Dawn French as Miriam Forcible and her other-world counterpart, Keith David as the cat, John Hodgman as Charlie Jones and the other father. John Linnell additionally provides the latter's singing voice. Robert Bailey Jr. as Wyborn Wybie Lovat, Ian McShane as Sergei Alexander Bobensky and his other-world counterpart, Anka Neal, George Selick and Hannah Kaiser as the ghost children, Harry Selick and Marina Bidovsky as Coraline's friends back in Pontiac, Michigan, Caroline Crawford as Mrs. Lovat. Production: Coraline was a huge risk. But these days in animation, the safest bet is to take a risk. Director Henry Selick met author Neil Gaiman just as Gaiman was finishing the novel Coraline, which was published in 2002, and as Gaiman was a fan of Selick's The Nightmare Before Christmas, 1993, he invited him to make a film adaptation. As Selick thought a direct adaptation would lead to maybe a 47-minute movie, his screenplay had some expansions, such as the creation of Wybie, who was only mentioned in the novel as the boy who lived in the house before Coraline. The character was expanded in order to not make it seem like Coraline was talking to herself all the time. When looking for a design different from that of most animation, Selick discovered the work of Japanese illustrator Tadahiro Yasuji and invited him to become the concept artist. One of Yasuji's biggest influences was on the color palette, which was muted in reality and more colorful in the other world, as in The Wizard of Oz, 1939. 6. Yasuji said, at the beginning, it was supposed to be a small project over a few weeks to simply create characters. However, I ended up working on the project for over a year, eventually designing sets and backgrounds, on top of drawing the basic images for the story to be built upon. 7. Coraline was staged in a 140,000 square foot, 13,000 square meters, warehouse in Hillsboro, Oregon. 5-8. The stage was divided into 50 lots. 9. Which played host to nearly 150 sets. 5. Among the sets were 3 miniature Victorian mansions, a 42-foot, 12.8 m, apple orchard, and a model of Ashland, Oregon, including tiny details such as banners for the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. 8. The amazing garden scene was the most complicated set created for the film. The hundreds of handmade flowers were created to grow and move accordingly when Coraline entered the garden. 10. More than 28 animators worked at a time on rehearsing or shooting scenes, producing 90 to 100 seconds of finished animation each week. 11. To capture stereoscopy for the 3D release, the animators shot each frame from 2 slightly apart camera positions. 6. Every object on the screen was made for the film. 6. The crew used 3 3D printing systems from Objet in the development and production of the film. Thousands of high-quality 3D models, ranging from facial expressions to doorknobs, were printed in 3D using the PolyJet matrix systems, which enable the fast transformation of 3D, computer-aided design. drawings into high-quality 3D models. 12. The puppets had separate parts for the upper and lower parts of the head that could be exchanged for different facial expressions. 6. And the characters could exhibit over 208,000 facial expressions. 12. In the Hidden Worlds, the films of Laika. Exhibit at Seattle's Museum of Pop Culture. The sign for Replacing Faces display said there were 207,336 possible face combinations for Coraline and 17,633 for her mother. Selleck wanted to leave the seams in the characters' faces to show the handmade nature of the puppets, but Laika owner Phil Knight requested that the seams be removed digitally. 13. There were 28 identical puppets of Coraline. Each one took 3 to 4 months to make and usually took 10 people to construct each one. 14. Computer artists composited separately shot elements together or added their elements, which had to look handcrafted, not computer-generated. For instance, the flames were done with traditional animation and painted digitally, and the fog was dry ice. 6. At its peak, the film involved the efforts of 450 people, 5, including 38 to 35 animators and digital designers in the Digital Design Group, DDG, directed by Dan Casey, and more than 250 technicians and designers. 8. Principal photography took 18 months. One crew member, Althea Chrome, was hired specifically to knit miniature sweaters and other clothing for the puppet characters, sometimes using knitting needles as thin as human hair. 5. A single garment could take anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months to complete. The clothes also simulated were using paint and a file. 6. The soundtrack for Coraline features songs by Bruno Calais with one Other Father song by They Might Be Giants. The Other Father's singing voice is provided by John Linnell, one of the band's singers. The band was hired to write an entire soundtrack for the film, but according to John Flansburgh, the production team wanted the music to be more creepy, and only one song was ultimately used. 15. Colais's score was performed by the Budapest Symphony Orchestra and features choral pieces sung by the Children's Choir of Nice in a nonsense language. 16. One of the choir members is coincidentally named Coraline. 16. Coraline won Calais the 2009 Annie Award for Best Score for an Animated Feature. According to Paul Durgarabedian, a film business analyst with Media by Numbers, for the film to succeed it needed a box office comparable to Wallace and Gromit, The Curse of the Were-Rabbit, which had grossed $16 million its opening weekend and ended up grossing $125 million worldwide. Before the film's release, Durgarabedian thought Laika Studios should be pleased was Coraline to make $10 million in its opening weekend. 8. In its U.S. opening weekend, the film grossed $16.85 million, ranking third at the box office. 17. It made $15 million during its second weekend, bringing its U.S. total up to $35.6 million, $25.5 million of which came from 3D presentations. 18. The film was re-released on August 14, 2023, grossing over $7 million over 4 days. 1920. For its 15th anniversary, it was re-released the following year in 3D on August 16, 2024, and made $12.5 million in 4 days, finishing fifth at the box office. 2021. By August 23, the 2024 re-release had grossed $29.2 million worldwide, making it the highest-grossing re-release in the history of Fathom Events. 22-23. As of September 24, 2024, the re-release had grossed $52.4 million worldwide, bringing the film's lifetime total gross to $185.7 million worldwide. 3. The 15th anniversary re-release became the second highest-grossing re-release of a film of all time in the UK. It also earned more than its initial box gross from 2009 release in Mexico. 24. Critical response. On the review aggregator website Rotten Tomatoes, the film holds an approval rating of 91% based on 279 reviews, with an average rating of July 8, 10. The website's critics' consensus reads, with its vivid stop-motion animation combined with Neil Gaiman's imaginative story, Coraline is a film that's both visually stunning and wondrously entertaining. 25. Metacritic, which uses a weighted average, assigned the film a score of 80 out of 100 based on reviews from 40 critics, indicating generally favorable reviews. 26. Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times gave the film 3 stars out of 4, calling it a beautiful film about several nasty people, as well as nightmare fodder for children, however brave, under a certain age. 27. David Edelstein of New York Magazine said the film is a bona fide fairy tale that needed a touch less entrancement and a touch more story. 28. A.O. Scott of the New York Times called the film exquisitely realized, with a slower pace and a more contemplative tone than the novel. It is certainly exciting, but rather than race through ever noisier set pieces toward a hectic climax in the manner of so much animation aimed at kids, Coraline lingers in an atmosphere that is creepy, wonderfully strange, and full of feeling. 29. In 2009, the American Film Institute named Coraline as part of their Top 10 Movies of the Year list. 30. The film amassed a cult following. 31. It has since been regarded as a groundbreaking work in stop-motion animation and one of the greatest animated films of all time. The film was released on DVD and Blu-ray in the United States on July 21, 2009, by Universal Studios Home Entertainment. A 3D version comes with 4 sets of 3D glasses, specifically the green magenta anaglyph image. Coraline was released on DVD and Blu-ray in the United Kingdom on October 12, 2009. A 3D version of the film was also released on a 2-disc collector's edition. The DVD opened to first-week sales of $1,036,845 and over $19 million in revenue. Total sales stand at over 2.6 million units and over $45 million in revenue. 4. A 2-disc Blu-ray 3D set, which includes a stereoscopic 3D on the first disc and an anaglyph 3D image, was released in 2011. A new edition from Shout! Factory under license from Universal was released on August 31, 2021. 36. The film was released on 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray on December 13, 2022. The website for Coraline involves an interactive exploration game where the player can scroll through Coraline's world. It won the 2009 Webby Award for Best Use of Animation or Motion Graphics, both by the People and the Webby organization. It was also nominated for the Webby Movie and Film category. 38. On June 16, 2008, D3 Publisher announced the release of a video game based on the film. It was developed by Papaya Studio for the Wii and PlayStation 2 and by Art Company for Nintendo DS. It was released on January 27, 2009, close to the film's theatrical release. 39. The soundtrack was released digitally February 3, 2009, by E1 Music and in stores on February 24, 2009. Stop motion, also known as stop-frame animation or object animation, is an animated filmmaking and special effects technique in which objects are physically manipulated in small increments between individually photographed frames so that they will appear to exhibit independent motion or change when the series of frames is played back. Any kind of object can thus be animated, but puppets with movable joints, puppet animation, or clay figures, claymation, are most commonly used. Puppets, models, or clay figures built around an armature are used in model animation. Stop motion with live actors is often referred to as pixelation. Stop motion of flat materials such as paper, fabrics, or photographs is usually called cutout animation. A stop motion video. A penny which appears to be moving on its own through stop motion techniques. Terminology. The term stop motion, relating to the animation technique, is often spelled with a hyphen as stop motion either standalone or as a compound modifier. Both orthographic variants, with and without the hyphen, are correct, but the hyphenated one has a second meaning that is unrelated to animation or cinema, a device for automatically stopping a machine or engine when something has gone wrong. 2. History. The use of animated objects in film has been present since the early days of cinema. 3. 1849 to 1895, before film. Main article: Early History of Animation. Before the advent of chronophotography in 1878, a small number of photograph series depicted subjects in successive positions. These can now be regarded as a form of stop motion or pixelation, although very few results were meant to be animated. Until celluloid film base was established in 1888 and set the standard for the moving image, animation could only be presented via mechanisms such as the zoetrope. In 1849, Joseph Plateau published a note about improvements for his phantoscope, aka phenakistoscope. A new translucent variation had improved picture quality and could be viewed with both eyes by several people at the same time. Plateau stated that the illusion could be advanced even further with an idea communicated to him by Charles Wheatstone, a combination of the phantoscope and Wheatstone's stereoscope. Plateau thought the construction of a sequential set of stereoscopic image pairs would be the more difficult part of the plan than adapting two copies of his improved phantoscope to be fitted with a stereoscope. Wheatstone had suggested using photographs on paper of a solid object, for instance a statuette. Plateau concluded that for this purpose 16 plaster models could be made with 16 regular modifications. He believed such a project would take much time and careful effort, but would be quite worth it because of the expected marvelous results. 4. The plan was never executed, possibly because Plateau was almost completely blind by this time. In 1852, Jules Dubosc patented a stereoscope phantoscope ou bioscope, or abbreviated as stereophantoscope, stroboscopic disc. The only known extant disc contains stereoscopic photograph pairs of different phases of the motion of a machine. Due to the long exposure times necessary to capture an image with the photographic emulsions of the period, the sequence could not be recorded live and must have been assembled from separate photographs of the various positions of the machinery. In 1855, Johann Nepomuk Cermak published an article about his stereophonoscope and other experiments aimed at stereoscopic moving images. He mentioned a method of sticking needles in a stroboscopic disc so that it looked like one needle was being pushed in and out of the cardboard when animated. He realized that this method provided basically endless possibilities to make different 3D animations. He then introduced two methods to animate stereoscopic pairs of images. One was basically a stereo viewer using two stroboscopic discs, and the other was more or less similar to the later zoetrope. Cermak explained how suitable stereoscopic photographs could be made by recording a series of models, for instance to animate a growing pyramid. 5. On February 27, 1860, Peter Hubert Desvines received British patent number 537 for 28 monocular and stereoscopic variations of cylindrical stroboscopic devices, much like the later zoetrope. 6. Desvines' mimoscope received an honorable mention for ingenuity of construction at the 1862 International Exhibition in London. 7. Desvines employed models, insects and other objects instead of pictures, with perfect success. 8. In 1874, Jules Janssen made several practice discs for the recording of the Passage of Venus with his series Passage to Venus with his photographic revolver. He used a model of the planet and a light source standing in for the sun. 9. While actual recordings of the Passage of Venus have not been located, some practice discs survived and the images of one were turned into a short animated film decades after the development of cinematography. It is estimated that 80 to 90% of all silent films are lost. 11. Extant contemporary movie catalogs, reviews, and other documentation can provide some details on lost films, but this kind of written documentation is also incomplete and often insufficient to properly date all extant films or even identify them if original titles are missing. Whether any scene was created with stop-motion techniques often remains unclear in extant descriptions. The principles of animation and other special effects were mostly kept a secret, not only to prevent use of such techniques by competitors, but also to keep audiences interested in the mystery of the magic tricks. 12. Stop motion is closely related to the stop trick, in which the camera is temporarily stopped during the recording of a scene to create a change before filming is continued, or for which the cause of the change is edited out of the film. In the resulting film, The change will be sudden, and a logical cause of the change will be mysteriously absent or replaced with a fake cause that is suggested in the scene. The oldest known example is used for the beheading in Edison Manufacturing Company's 1895 film The Execution of Mary Stuart. The technique of stop motion can be interpreted as repeatedly applying the stop trick. In 1917, clay animation pioneer Helena Smith Dayton referred to the principle behind her work as stop action, 13, a synonym of stop motion. French trick film pioneer Georges Méliès claimed to have invented the stop trick and popularized it by using it in many of his short films. He reportedly used stop-motion animation in 1899 to produce moving letterforms. 14. Segundo de Common. Julianne Mathieu in a stop-motion/pixelation scene from Hotel Electrique, 1908. Spanish filmmaker Segundo de Common, 1871 to 1929, made many trick films in France for PAF. He has often been compared to Georges Méliès, as he also made many fantasy films with stop tricks and other illusions, helped by his wife, Julianne Mathieu. Le Théâtre de Bob, March 1906, 15, features stop motion with dolls and objects to represent a fictional automated theater owned by Bob, played by a live-action child actor. The film used to be credited to de Common, but this has been disputed since new research proved that he wasn't in Paris during the film's production. Direction and special effects have also been attributed to Gaston Bell. 16. Did Chaumont more likely directed the similar 1909 short Le Théâtre Électrique de Bob? J. Stuart Blackton's The Haunted Hotel, February 23, 1907, 26, featured a combination of live action with practical special effects and stop-motion animation of several objects, a puppet and a model of the haunted hotel. It was the first stop-motion film to receive wide-scale appreciation. Especially a large close-up view of a table being set by itself baffled viewers. There were no visible wires or other noticeable well-known tricks. 27. This inspired other filmmakers, including French animator Émile Cohl, 28, and Segundo de Common. De Common would release the similar short films The House of Ghosts, La Maison Ensorcelée, in 1907 and Hotel Électrique in 1908, with the latter also containing some very early pixelation. The Humpty Dumpty Circus, 1908, considered lost, by Blackton and his British-American Vitagraph partner Albert E. Smith, showed an animated performance of figures from a popular wooden toy set. 29. Smith would later claim that this was the first stop-motion picture in America. The inspiration would have come from seeing how puffs of smoke behaved in the interrupted recordings for a stop trick film they were making. Smith would have suggested to get a patent for the technique, but Blackton thought it wasn't that important. 30. Smith's recollections are not considered to be very reliable. Blackton's The Haunted Hotel made a big impression in Paris, where it was released as L'Hôtel Hanté, Phantasmagorie Épouvantable. When Gaumont bought a copy to further distribute the film, it was carefully studied by some of their filmmakers to find out how it was made. Reportedly, it was newcomer Émile Cohl who unraveled the mystery. 33. Not long after, Cohl released his first film, Japon de Fantaisie, June 1907, 34, featuring his own imaginative use of the stop-motion technique. It was followed by the revolutionary hand-drawn Phantasmagorie, August 17, 1908, and many more animated films by Cohl. Other notable stop-motion films by Cohl include Les Allumettes Animés, Animated Matches, 1908, 35, and Mobilier Fiddly, 1910, in collaboration with Romeo Bossetti. 36. Mobilier Fiddly is often confused with Bossetti's object animation Tour de Force Le Garde Mobiles Automatique, the automatic moving company, 1912. 37, 38. Both films feature furniture moving by itself. Arthur Melbourne Cooper. Of the more than 300 short films produced between 1896 and 1915 by British film pioneer Arthur Melbourne Cooper, an estimated 36 contained forms of animation. Based on later reports by Melbourne Cooper and by his daughter Audrey Wadowska, some believe that Cooper's Matches, an appeal, was produced in 1899 and therefore the first stop-motion animation. The extant black and white film shows a matchstick figure writing an appeal to donate a guinea for which Bryant and May would supply soldiers with sufficient matches. No archival records are known that could prove that the film was indeed created in 1899 during the beginning of the Second Boer War. Others place it at 1914, during the beginning of World War I. 39-40, Cooper created more animated matches scenes in the same setting. These are believed to also have been produced in 1899-41, while a release date of 1908 has also been given. 42. The 1908 animated matches film by Emil Cole may have caused more confusion about the release dates of Cooper's matchstick animations. It also raises the question whether Cole may have been inspired by Melbourne Cooper or vice versa. As a means to plan his performances, ballet dancer and choreographer Alexander Shiryaev started making approximately 20 to 25 centimeter tall puppets out of papier-mâché on posable wire frames. He then sketched all the sequential movements on paper. When he arranged these vertically on a long strip, it was possible to give a presentation of the complete dance with a home cinema projector. Later on, he bought a movie camera, and between 1906 and 1909, he made many short films, including puppet animations. As a dancer and choreographer, Shiryaev had a special talent to create motion in his animated films. According to animator Peter Lord, his work was decades ahead of its time. Part of Shiryaev's animation work is featured in Viktor Bocharov's documentary Alexander Shiryaev, a belated premiere, 2003. Ladislas Starevich, Russian period. Polish-Russian Ladislas Starevich, 1882–1965, started his film career around 1909 in Kaunas filming live insects. He wanted to document rutting stag beetles, but the creatures wouldn't cooperate or would even die under the bright lamps needed for filming. He solved the problem by using wire for the limbs of dried beetles and then animating them in stop motion. The resulting short film, presumably 1 minute long, 45, was probably titled by the Latin name for the species, Lucanus cervus, 1910, considered lost. After moving to Moscow, Starevich continued animating dead insects, but now as characters in imaginative stories with much dramatic complexity. He garnered much attention and international acclaim with these short films, including the 10-minute The Beautiful Lucanida, March 1912, the 2-minute Happy Scenes from Animal Life, the 12-minute The Cameraman's Revenge, October 1912, and the 5-minute The Grasshopper and the Ant, 1913. Reportedly, many viewers were impressed with how much could be achieved with trained insects, or at least wondered what tricks could have been used, since few people were familiar with the secrets of stop-motion animation. The Insect's Christmas, 1913, featured other animated puppets, including Father Christmas and a frog. Starevich made several other stop-motion films in the next 2 years, but mainly went on to direct live-action short and feature films before he fled from Russia in 1918. Willis O'Brien's first stop-motion film was The Dinosaur and the Missing Link, a prehistoric tragedy, 1915. Apart from the titular dinosaur and missing link ape, it featured several cavemen and an ostrich-like, desert quail, all relatively lifelike models made with clay. 46. This led to a series of short animated comedies with a prehistoric theme for Edison Company, including Prehistoric Poultry, 1916, RFD 10,000 BC, 1917, The Birth of a Flivver, 1917, and Curious Pets of Our Ancestors, 1917. O'Brien was then hired by producer Herbert M. Dolly to direct, create effects, co-write and co-star with him for The Ghost of Slumber Mountain, 1918. The collaborative film combined live action with animated dinosaur models in a 45-minute film, but after the premiere it was cut down to approximately 12 minutes. Dolly did not give O'Brien credits for the visual effects, and instead claimed the animation process as his own invention, and even applied for patents. 47. O'Brien's stop-motion work was recognized as a technique to create lifelike creatures for adventure films. O'Brien further pioneered the technique with animated dinosaur sequences for the live-action feature The Lost World, 1925. Stills from Battle of the Suds and other Helena Smith Dayton films, 1917. New York artist Helena Smith Dayton, possibly the first female animator, had much success with her caricatypes clay statuettes before she began experimenting with clay animation. Some of her first resulting short films were screened on March 25, 1917. She released an adaptation of William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet approximately half a year later. Although the films and her technique received much attention of the press, it seems she did not continue making films after she returned to New York from managing a YMCA in Paris around 1918. None of her films have yet surfaced, but the extant magazine articles have provided several stills and approximately 20 poorly printed frames from 2 film strips. 48. Stairwitch in Paris. By 1920, Stairwitch had settled in Paris and started making new stop-motion films. Dans les Griffes de l'Ironie, finished 1920, released 1924, featured detailed handmade insect puppets that could convey facial expressions with moving lips and eyelids. Other silent stop-motion. One of the earliest clay animation films was Modeling Extraordinary, which impressed audiences in 1912, citation needed. The early Italian feature film Cuberia, 1914, featured some stop-motion techniques, citation needed. 1930s and 1940s. Stairwitch finished the first feature stop-motion film Le Roman de Renard, The Tale of the Fox, in 1930, but problems with its soundtrack delayed its release. In 1937, it was released with a German soundtrack, and in 1941 with its French soundtrack. Hungarian-American filmmaker George Powell developed his own stop-motion technique of replacing wooden dolls, or parts of them, with similar figures displaying changed poses and/or expressions. He called it Powell and used it for his Puppetoons films since 1932. The particular replacement animation method itself also became better known as Puppetoon. In Europe, he mainly worked on promotional films for companies such as Philips. Later, Powell gained much success in Hollywood with a string of Academy Award for Best Animated Short Films, including Rhythm in the Ranks, 1941, Tulip Shall Grow, 1942, Jasper and the Haunted House, 1942. The Dr. Seuss penned The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins, 1943, and To Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street, 1944, Jasper and the Beanstalk, 1945, John Henry and the Inky Pooh, 1946, Jasper in a Jam, 1946, and Tubby the Tuba, 1947. Many of his Puppetoon films were selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry. 1933's King Kong used stop-motion to bring to life a monstrous ape that interacted with human actors. Willis O'Brien's expressive and emotionally convincing animation of the Big Ape in King Kong, 1933, is widely regarded as a milestone in stop-motion animation and a highlight of Hollywood cinema in general. In 1935, The New Gulliver, a Soviet stop-motion animated cartoon, made an extensive use of puppet animation, running almost all the way through the film. It begins and ends with short live-action sequences. The film was released to widespread acclaim and earned director Alexander Tushko a special prize at the International Cinema Festival in Milan. A 1940 promotional film for Autolite, an automotive parts supplier, featured stop-motion animation of its products marching past Autolite factories to the tune of Franz Schubert's Military March. An abbreviated version of the sequence was later used in television ads for Autolite, especially those on the 1950s CBS program Suspense, which Autolite sponsored. The first British animated feature was the stop-motion instruction film Handling Ships, 1945, by Hallis and Batchelor for the British Admiralty. It was not meant for general cinemas, but did become part of the official selection of the 1946 Cannes Film Festival. The first Belgian animated feature was an adaptation of the Tintin comic The Crab with the Golden Claws, 1947, with animated puppets. The first Czech animated feature was the package film The Czech Year, 1947, with animated puppets by Jiří Trunka. The film won several awards at the Venice Film Festival and other international festivals. Trunka would make several more award-winning stop-motion features, including The Emperor's Nightingale, 1949, Prince Byaya, 1950, Old Czech Legends, 1953, or A Midsummer Night's Dream, 1959. He also directed many short films and experimented with other forms of animation. 1950s. Duration. 3 minutes and 10 seconds. 3 to 10. Gumbasia, 1955, by Art Clokey. Ray Harryhausen learned under O'Brien on the film Mighty Joe Young, 1949. Harryhausen would go on to create many memorable stop-motion effects for a string of successful fantasy films over the next 3 decades. These included The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, 1953, It Came from Beneath the Sea, 1955, Jason and the Argonauts, 1963, The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, 1973, and Clash of the Titans, 1981. It wasn't until 1954 before a feature animated film with a technique other than cell animation was produced in the U.S. The first was the stop-motion adaptation of 19th-century composer Engelbert Humperdinck's opera Hansel und Gretel as Hansel and Gretel, an opera fantasy. In 1955, Karel Zeman made his first feature film Journey to the Beginning of Time, inspired by Jules Verne, featuring stop-motion animation of dinosaurs and other prehistoric creatures. Art Clokey started his adventures in clay with a freeform clay short film called Gumbasia, 1955, which shortly thereafter propelled him into the production of his more structured TV series Gumby, 1955 to 1989, with the iconic titular character. In partnership with the United Lutheran Church in America, he also produced Davy and Goliath, 1960 to 2004. The theatrical feature Gumby, the movie, 1992, released in 1995, was a box office bomb. In Hungary, Hungarian, French puppet designer and animated film director, Eva Balafalus, began her series of 6 animated films with various collaborators, with the sculptor Zoltán Olcsykis, Mejia Juha Samarin in 1948, and Vitamin ABC in 1950, Kaksa in 1951, Bakas Tobias in 1953, Misi and Mahasna Koksagral in 1956, and Adidurgo Karali in 1957. On November 22, 1959, the first episode of Unser Sandmännchen, Our Little Sandman, was broadcast on DFF, East German television. The 10-minute daily bedtime show for young children features the title character as an animated puppet and other puppets in different segments. A very similar Sandmännchen series, possibly conceived earlier, ran on West German television from December 1, 1959 until the German reunification in 1989. The East German show was continued on other German networks when DFF ended in 1991 and is one of the longest-running animated series in the world. Citation needed. The theatrical feature Das Sandmännchen, Abenteuer im Traumland, 2010, was fully animated with stop-motion puppets. Pat and Matt, two inventive but clumsy neighbors, was introduced in 1976-49, while the first made-for-TV episode Tatey, Translated Wallpaper, was produced in 1979 for SD Bratislava. Japanese puppet animator Tadahito Machinaga started out as assistant animator in short anime, propaganda, films RH-on, 1941, and Momotaro no Umawashi, 1943. He fled to Manchukuo during the war and stayed in China afterwards. Due to the scarcity of paint and film stock shortly after the war, Machinaga decided to work with puppets and stop motion. His work helped popularize puppet animation in China before he returned to Japan around 1953, where he continued working as animation director. In the 1960s, Machinaga supervised the Unimagic puppet animation for productions by Arthur Rankin Jr. and Jules Bass Videographed International, Limited, later called Rankin/Bass Productions Incorporated, and Dentsu. Starting with the syndicated television series The New Adventures of Pinocchio, 1960 to 1961. The Christmas TV special Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer has been telecasted annually since 1964 and has become one of the most beloved holiday specials in the United States. They made 3 theatrical feature films: Willie McBean and His Magic Machine, 1965, The Daydreamer, 1966, Stop Motion/Live Action, and Mad Monster Party, 1966, released in 1967, and the television special Ballad of Smokey the Bear, 1966, before the collaboration ended. Rankin/Bass worked with other animators for more TV specials, with titles such as The Little Drummer Boy, 1968, Santa Claus is Comin' to Town, 1970, and Here Comes Peter Cottontail, 1971. British television has shown many stop-motion series for young children since the 1960s. An early example is Snip and Snap, 1960 to 1961, by John Hollis and collaboration with Danish paper sculptor Thok Sondergaard, Thoki Yen, featuring Dog Snap, cut from a sheet of paper by pair of scissors Snip. Apart from their cutout animation series, British studio Small Films, Peter Furman and Oliver Postgate, produced several stop-motion series with puppets, beginning with Penguins, 1961 to 1965. Featuring penguin-like birds knitted by Peter's wife Joan and filmed on their farm, where most of their productions were filmed in an unused barn. It was followed by Pogle's Wood, 1965 to 1967, Clangers, 1969 to 1972, 1974, revived in 2015, Bagpoos, 1974, and Tatai, The Story of a Doll's House, 1984. Czech surrealist filmmaker Jan Spankmajers released his short artistic films since 1964, which usually contain much experimental stop motion. He started to gain much international recognition in the 1980s. Since 1988, he has mostly been directing feature films which feature much more live action than stop motion. These include Alice, an adaptation of Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and Faust, a rendition of The Legend of the German Scholar. Spankmajers' work has been highly influential on other artists, such as Terry Gilliam and the Quay brothers, although the latter claim to have only discovered Spankmajers' films after having developed their own similar style. French animator Serge Danet created The Magic Roundabout, 1965, which played for many years on the BBC. Polish studios Sejmofer produced popular TV series with animated puppets and adaptations of Collargull, Barnaby the Bear in the UK, Jeremy in Canada, 1967 to 1974, and The Moments, 1977 to 1982. In the 1960s and 1970s, independent clay animator Elliot Noyes Jr. refined the technique of free-form clay animation with his Oscar-nominated 1965 film Clay, or The Origin of Species. Noyes also used stop motion to animate sand lying on glass for his musical animated film Sandman, 1975. Italian director Francesco Mizzeri created the clay animation TV series Mio Mao, 1970 to 1976, 2002 to 2007, The Red and the Blue, Il Rosso e il Blu, 1976, and a TV series with an animated origami duck Quaqueo, 1978 to 1979. The British artists Brian Cosgrove and Mark Hull, Cosgrove Hall Films, produced two stop-motion animated adaptations of Enid Blyton's Not a Book series, including the original series of the same name, 1975 to 1982, and Nada's Toyland Adventures, 1992 to 2001, a full-length film The Wind in the Willows, 1983, and later a multi-season TV series, both based on Kenneth Grahame's classic children's book of the same title. They also produced a documentary of their production techniques, Making Frog and Toad. In 1975, filmmaker and clay animation experimenter Will Vinton joined with sculptor Bob Gardiner to create an experimental film called Closed Mondays, which became the first stop-motion film to win an Oscar. Will Vinton followed with several other successful short film experiments, including The Great Cognito, The Creation, and Rip Van Winkle, which were each nominated for Academy Awards. In 1977, Vinton made a documentary about this process and his style of animation, which he dubbed Claymation. He titled the documentary Claymation. Soon after this documentary, the term was trademarked by Vinton to differentiate his team's work from others who had been, or were beginning to do, clay animation. While the word has stuck and is often used to describe clay animation and stop motion, it remains a trademark owned currently by Leica Entertainment. Incorporated 20 clay animation episodes featuring the clown Mr. Bill were a feature of Saturday Night Live, starting from a first appearance in February 1976. At very much the same time in the UK, Peter Lord and David Sprossen formed Aardman Animations that would produce many commercials, TV series, short films, and eventually also feature films. In 1976, they created the character Morph, who appeared as an animated sidekick to the TV presenter Tony Hart on his BBC TV program Take Heart. The 5-inch high presenter was made from a traditional British modeling clay called plasticine. In 1977, they started on a series of animated films, again using modeling clay, but this time made for a more adult audience. The soundtrack for Down and Out was recorded in a Salvation Army hostel, and plasticine puppets were animated to dramatize the dialogue. A second film, also for the BBC, followed in 1978. A TV series, The Amazing Adventures of Morph, was aired in 1980. Sand-coated puppet animation was used in the Oscar-winning 1977 film The Sandcastle, produced by Dutch-Canadian animator Co Hoedman. Hoedman was one of dozens of animators sheltered by the National Film Board of Canada, a Canadian government film arts agency that had supported animators for decades. A pioneer of refined multiple stop-motion films under the NFB banner was Norman McLaren, who brought in many other animators to create their own creatively controlled films. Notable among these are the pin-screen animation films of Jacques Drouin, made with the original pin screen donated by Alexander Alexieff and Claire Parker. Czech filmmakers Lubomir Benes and Vladimir Jiranek debuted their animated puppet characters Pat and Matt, two inventive but clumsy neighbors, in the 7-minute short Kotasi in 1976. Since 1979, over 100 episodes have been broadcast irregularly, 50. Since 2014, new episodes were presented in theatrically released package films. The series became very popular in several countries, especially in the Netherlands, the only country where the characters are voiced. One of the main British animation teams, John Hardwick and Bob Bura, were the main animators in many early British TV shows, and are famous for their work on the Trumptonshire trilogy, Camberwick Green, Trumpton and Chigley. Their company was named Stop Motion Limited, 51, the term having been their trademark until it became generic, 52. Disney experimented with several stop-motion techniques by hiring independent animator director Mike Jittlov to make the first stop-motion animation of Mickey Mouse toys ever produced, in a short sequence called Mouse Mania, part of a TV special, Mickey's 50, which commemorated Mickey's 50th anniversary in 1978. Jittlov again produced some impressive multi-technique stop-motion animation a year later for a 1979 Disney special promoting their release of the feature film The Black Hole. Titled Major Effects, Jitlov's work stood out as the best part of the special. Jitlov released his footage the following year to 16mm film collectors as a short film titled The Wizard of Speed and Time, along with 4 of his other short multi-technique animated films, most of which eventually evolved into his own feature-length film of the same title. Effectively demonstrating almost all animation techniques, as well as how he produced them, the film was released to theaters in 1987 and to video in 1989. 1980s. In the 1970s and 1980s, Industrial Light and Magic often used stop-motion model animation in such films as the original Star Wars trilogy, the Holochus sequence in Star Wars, the Tauntauns and Adat Walkers in The Empire Strikes Back, and the Adasti Walkers in Return of the Jedi were all filmed using stop-motion animation, with the latter 2 films utilizing Go Motion, an invention from renowned visual effects veteran Phil Tippett. The many shots, including the ghosts in Raiders of the Lost Ark, the dragon in Dragon Slayer, and the first 2 feature films in the RoboCop series, used Tippett's Go Motion. In the UK, Aardman Animations continued to grow. Channel 4 funded a new series of clay animated films, conversation pieces, using recorded soundtracks of real people talking. A further series in 1986, called Lip Sync, premiered the work of Richard Golzowski, Ident, Barry Purves, Next, and Nick Park, Creature Comforts, as well as further films by Sprossen and Lord. Creature Comforts won the Oscar for Best Animated Short in 1990. In 1986, they also produced a notable music video for Sledgehammer, a song by Peter Gabriel. In 1980, Mark Paul Chinoy directed the first feature-length clay animated film, based on the famous Pogo comic strip. Titled I Go Pogo. It was aired a few times on American cable channels, but has yet to be commercially released. Primarily clay, some characters required armatures, and walk cycles used pre-sculpted hard bases legs. 53. Stop motion was also used for some shots of the final sequence of the first Terminator movie, also for the scenes of the small alien ships in Spielberg's Batteries, not included in 1987, animated by David W. Allen. Allen's stop-motion work can also be seen in such feature films as The Crater Lake Monster, 1977, Q, The Winged Serpent, 1982, The Gate, 1987, and Freaked, 1993. Allen's King Kong Volkswagen commercial from the 1970s is now legendary among model animation enthusiasts. In 1985, Will Vinton and his team released an ambitious feature film in stop motion called The Adventures of Mark Twain, based on the life and works of the famous American author. While the film may have been a little sophisticated for young audiences at the time, it got rave reviews from critics and adults in general. Citation needed. Vinton's team also created the Gnomes and the Gnome King for Disney's Return to Oz feature, for which they received an Academy Award nomination for special visual effects. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Will Vinton became very well known for his commercial work as well, with stop-motion campaigns including the California Raisins and the Noid. Yuri Barta released his award-winning fantasy film The Pied Piper, 1986. From 1986 to 1991, Churchill Films produced The Mouse and the Motorcycle, Runaway Ralph and Ralphus, Mouse for ABC television. The shows featured stop-motion characters combined with live action, based on the books of Beverly Cleary. John Clark Matthews was the animation director, with Justin Cohn, Joel Fletcher, and Gail van der Merwe providing character animation. 54. The company also produced other films based on children's books. From 1986 to 2000, over 155-minute episodes of Pingu, a Swiss children's comedy, were produced by Trick Film Studio. 1989's A Grand Day Out introduced Nick Park's famous Wallace and Gromit characters, which are still animated in stop motion for all television and film appearances. Aardman Animation's Nick Park became very successful with his short claymation Creature Comforts in 1989, which had talking animals voicing box pop interviews. Park then used the same format to produce a series of commercials between 1990 and 1992. The commercials have been credited as having introduced a more caring way of advertising in the UK. Richard Golzowski later directed two 13-episode Creature Comforts TV series, 2003, 2005 to 2006, and a Christmas special, 2005. Also in 1989, Park introduced his very popular clay characters Wallace and Gromit in A Grand Day Out. 3 more short films and 2 feature films, and multiple spin-offs would follow. Among many other awards, Park won the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature for the feature-length outing Wallace and Gromit, The Curse of the Were Rabbit. Park also worked on the Chicken Run movie, which was another film from Aardman Animations. 1990s. In 1992, Trey Parker and Matt Stone made The Spirit of Christmas, a short cutout animated student film made with construction paper. In 1995, they made a second short with the same titled, commissioned as a Christmas greeting by Fox Broadcasting Company executive Brian Graydon. The concepts and characters were further developed into the TV hit series South Park since 1997. Except for the pilot, all animation has been created on computers in the same style. The Nightmare Before Christmas, 1993, directed by Henry Selick and produced by Tim Burton, was one of the more widely released stop-motion features and became the highest-grossing stop-motion animated movie of its time, grossing over $50 million domestic. Henry Selick also went on to direct James and the Giant Peach and Coraline, and Tim Burton went on to direct Corpse Bride and Frankenweenie. The stop-motion feature The Secret Adventures of Tom Thumb was released in 1993. In November 1998, the first episode of Bob the Builder released on BBC. Bob the Builder was a popular British stop-motion television series created by Keith Chapman and produced and owned by Hit Entertainment. In 1999, Will Vinton launched the first U.S. primetime stop-motion television series called The PJs, co-created by actor-comedian Eddie Murphy. The Emmy-winning sitcom aired on Fox for 2 seasons, then moved to the WB for an additional season. Vinton launched another series, Gary and Mike, for UPN in 2001. In 1999, Sunio Goda directed 30-second sketches of the character Domo. The shorts, animated by stop-motion studio Dwarf, are currently still produced in Japan and have received universal critical acclaim from fans and critics. Goda also directed the stop-motion movie series Kaminiko in 2004. The music video to Green 2018 by Cavetown, a modern example of stop-motion animation. The BBC commissioned 13 episodes of stop-frame animated Somerton Mill in 2004 as inserts into their flagship preschool program, Tikobilla. Created and produced by Pete Bryden and Ed Cookson, the series was then given its own slot on BBC One and BBC Two, and has been broadcast extensively around the world. Other notable stop-motion feature films released since 2000 include Fantastic Mr. Fox, 2009, $9.99, 2009, Hell and Back, 2015, Anomalisa, 2015, Olive Dogs, 2018, Alien Christmas, 2020, Henry Selick's Wendell and Wild, 2022, and Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, 2022. In 2003, the pilot film for the series Kirikiru and Friends, produced by Korean studio Fango Entertainment, is greenlight into a children's animated series in 2004 after an approval with the Gyeonggi Digital Contents Agency. It was aired in KBS One on November 24, 2006, and won the 13th Korean Animation Awards in 2007 for Best Animation. Fango Entertainment also worked with Frontier Works in Japan to produce the 2010 film remake of Cheburashka, 55. Since 2005, Robot Chicken has mostly utilized stop-motion animation, using custom-made action figures and other toys as principal characters. Since 2009, Laika, the stop-motion successor to Will Vinton Studios, has released 6 feature films, which have collectively grossed over $400 million. Coraline, 2009, Paranorman, 2012, The Box Trolls, 2014, Kobo and the Two Strings, 2016, Missing Link, 2019, and Wildwood, 2026. Directors like Tim Burton and Wes Anderson are still using stop-motion animation in some of their live-action films, 56, 57. In 2019 and 2020, cinematographer Jeffrey Gardner won back-to-back Daytime Creative Arts Emmy Awards for Outstanding Cinematography on the stop-motion series Tumble Leaf, Amazon Studios, marking one of the rare instances where a director of photography has been recognized for work in stop-motion television, 58, 59. While stop-motion histories often highlight animators and directors, Gardner's awards underscore the vital role of cinematography in the medium, where lighting, lenses, and miniature set design create the show's distinctive visual storytelling. In November 2024, Disney released Mickey and Minnie's Christmas Carols, a series of 5 stop-motion shorts featuring Mickey, Minnie, Donald, Daisy, Goofy, and Pluto. Stop-motion has very rarely been shot in stereoscopic 3D throughout film history. The first 3D stop-motion short was In Tune with Tomorrow, also known as Motor Rhythm, made in 1939 by John Norling. The second stereoscopic stop-motion release was The Adventures of Sam Space in 1955 by Paul Sprunk. The third and latest stop-motion short in stereo 3D was The Incredible Invasion of the 20,000 Giant Robots from Outer Space in 2000 by Elmer Kahn 60 and Alexander Lynch's 61-62. This is also the first ever 3D stereoscopic stop-motion and CGI short in the history of film. The first all-stop-motion 3D feature is Coraline, 2009, based on Neil Gaiman's best-selling novel and directed by Henry Selick, 63. Another recent example is the Nintendo 3DS video software, which comes with the option for stop-motion videos. This has been released December 8, 2011 as a 3DS system update. Also, the film Paranorman is in 3D stop-motion. Go Motion. Main article, Go Motion. Another more complicated variation on stop motion is Go Motion, co-developed by Phil Tippett and first used on the films The Empire Strikes Back, 1980, Dragon Slayer, 1981, and the RoboCop films. Go Motion involved programming a computer to move parts of a model slightly during each exposure of each frame of film, combined with traditional hand manipulation of the model in between frames, to produce a more realistic motion blurring effect. Tippett also used the process extensively in his 1984 short film Prehistoric Beast, a 10 minutes long sequence depicting a herbivorous dinosaur, Monoclonius, being chased by a carnivorous one, Tyrannosaurus. With new footage, Prehistoric Beast became Dinosaur. In 1985, a full-length dinosaurs documentary hosted by Christopher Reeve. Those Phil Tippett's Go Motion tests acted as motion models for his first photorealistic use of computers to depict dinosaurs in Jurassic Park in 1993. A low-tech, manual version of this blurring technique was originally pioneered by the Ladislaus Derwich in the silent era and was used in his feature film The Tale of the Fox, 1931. Comparison to computer-generated imagery. The reasons for using stop motion instead of the more advanced computer-generated imagery, CGI, include the appeal of its distinct look and the notion that it accurately displays real-life textures, while CGI texturing can look more artificial and isn't always quite as close to realism. 65. This is appreciated by a number of animation directors, such as Guillermo del Toro, 66, Henry Selick, 67, Tim Burton, 68, and Travis Knight, 69. Guillermo del Toro aimed to praise the benefits of stop motion in his movie Pinocchio, saying that he wanted the expressiveness and the material nature of a handmade piece of animation, an artisanal, beautiful exercise in carving, painting, sculpting. 70. Stop motion in other media. Many young people begin their experiments in movie making with stop motion, thanks to the ease of modern stop-motion software and online video publishing. 71. Singer-songwriter Oren Levy's music video for the song Her Morning Elegance was posted on YouTube on January 19, 2009. The video, directed by Levy and Yuval and Marav Nathan, uses stop motion and has achieved great success with over 25.4 million views, also earning a 2010 Grammy Award nomination for Best Short-Form Music Video. Stop motion has occasionally been used to create the characters for computer games as an alternative to CGI. The Virgin Interactive Entertainment Mythos game Magic and Mayhem, 1998, featured creatures built by stop-motion specialist Alan Friswell, who made the miniature figures from modeling clay and latex rubber over armatures of wire and ball-and-socket joints. The models were then animated one frame at a time and incorporated into the CGI elements of the game through digital photography. Clayfighter for the Super NES and the Neverhood and Hylix 2, 72. For the PC are other examples. Scientists at IBM used a scanning tunneling microscope to single out and move individual atoms, which were used to make characters in A Boy and His Atom. This was the tiniest scale stop-motion video made at that time. 73. Replicating the distinct tactile look of traditional stop motion has gained popularity in contemporary media through the use of CGI. This approach can often provide a more cost-effective and accessible means of achieving the stop-motion aesthetic. Noteworthy among such endeavors is the work of Blender animator Ian Worthington, exemplified by his 2021 short film, Captain Yajima. 74. Another prominent example of this trend includes the Lego Movie, which uses CGI to replicate the visual style and imperfections of stop motion. Horror is a film genre that seeks to elicit physical or psychological fear in its viewers. 2. Horror films often explore dark subject matter and may deal with transgressive topics or themes. Broad elements of the genre include monsters, apocalyptic events, and religious or folk beliefs. Horror films have existed since the early 20th century. Early inspirations predating film include folklore, the religious beliefs and superstitions of different cultures, and the Gothic and horror literature of authors such as Edgar Allan Poe, Bram Stoker, and Mary Shelley. From its origins in silent films and German Expressionism, horror became a codified genre only after the release of Dracula, 1931. Many subgenres emerged in subsequent decades, including body horror, comedy horror, erotic horror, slasher films, splatter films, supernatural horror, and psychological horror. The genre has been produced worldwide, varying in content and style between regions. Horror is particularly prominent in the cinema of Japan, Korea, and Thailand, among other countries. Despite being the subject of social and legal controversy due to their subject matter, some horror films and franchises have seen major commercial success, influenced society, and generated popular culture icons. Characteristics. See also, Horror and Terror. The book The Film Experience, An Introduction, 2021, defines the horror film as a genre with origins in Gothic literature that seeks to frighten the viewer. The authors highlight the fundamental elements of the horror film as characters with physical, psychological, or spiritual deformities, narratives built on suspense, surprise, and shock, and visual compositions that move between the dread of not seeing and the horror of seeing. 2. Alternatively, the Dictionary of Film Studies, 2012, defines the horror film as representing disturbing and dark subject matter, seeking to elicit responses of fear, terror, disgust, shock, suspense, and, of course, horror from their viewers. 3. In his chapter, The American Nightmare, Horror in the 70s, from the book Hollywood from Vietnam to Reagan, 2002, film critic Rubén would declared that the commonality between horror films is that normality is threatened by the monster. 4. This idea was further expanded on by Noel Carroll in his book The Philosophy of Horror, or Paradoxes of the Heart, 1990. He noted that repulsion must be pleasurable, as evidenced by the genre's popularity. 4. Before the release of Dracula, 1931, as historian Gary D. Rhodes explained, the ideas and terminology of horror films did not yet exist as a codified genre, although critics had used the term horror to describe films in reviews prior to Dracula's release. 5. Horror was a term used with a variety of meanings. In 1913, the magazine Moving Picture World defined horrors as showcasing striped convicts, murderous Indians, grinning black-handers, homicidal drunkards. 6. Some titles directly suggested horror, such as The Hand of Horror. 1914, a melodrama about a thief who steals from his own sister. 6. During the silent era, the term horror was used to describe everything from battle scenes in war films to stories of drug addiction. 7. Rhodes concluded that the term horror film or horror movie was not used in early cinema. 8. The mystery film genre was then in vogue, and early information commonly promoted Dracula as a mystery film, despite the novel, the play, and the film relying on the supernatural. 9. Kim Newman discussed the genre in British Film Institute's book Companion to Horror, where he noted that horror films in the 1930s were easy to identify, but after that decade, the more blurred distinctions become, and horror becomes less like a discrete genre than an effect which can be deployed within any number of narrative settings or narrative patterns. 10. In the 1940s, the horror film was viewed in different terms. Critic Siegfried Kracauer included The Lost Weekend among films described as terror films, along with Shadow of a Doubt, 1943, The Dark Corner, 1946, Gaslight, 1944, Shock, 1946, The Spiral Staircase, 1946, The Stranger, 1946, and Spellbound, 1945. 2 years earlier, the New York Times described a new cycle of horror productions included Gaslight, The Woman in the Window, 1944, Dark Waters, 1944, Laura, 1944, and Phantom Lady, 1944. 11. Mark Jankovich wrote in the book The Shifting Definitions of Genre, Essays on Labeling Films, Television Shows, and Media, 2008, that horror was virtually synonymous with mystery as a generic term, not being limited to films concerned with the strange, eerie, and uncanny. 11. Various writings on genre from Altman, Lawrence Alloway, Violent America, the movies 1946 to 1964, 1971, and Peter Hutchings, Approaches to Popular Film, 1995. implied that it is easier to view films as cycles rather than genres, suggesting that viewing the slasher film as a cycle would locate it in terms of several factors: the film industry's economy and production, the personnel involved in particular eras, and the manner of film marketing, distribution, and exhibition. 12. In an essay, Mark Jankovic declared that there is no simple, collective belief as to what constitutes the horror genre among fans and critics of the genre. 13. Jankovic found that disagreements existed between audiences who wanted to distinguish themselves. Such disagreement included fans of other genres who may view a film such as Alien, 1979, as belonging to science fiction, as well as horror fans dismissing it as inauthentic for either genre. 14. Further debates exist among genre fans having personal definitions of true horror films. Some fans embrace cult figures, such as Freddy Krueger of the A Nightmare on Elm Street series, while other fans disassociate themselves from characters and series and focus instead on genre auteur directors such as Dario Argento, while still other fans would deem Argento's films too mainstream, preferring more underground films. 15. Andrew Tudor wrote in his book Monsters and Mad Scientists, A Cultural History of the Horror Movie, that genre is what we collectively believe it to be. Mirrors are often used to create a sense of tension in horror films. Mirrors are often used in horror films to create visual depth and build tension. Shelton argues that mirrors have been used so often in horror films that audiences have been conditioned to fear them, and subverting audience expectations of a jump scare in a mirror can further build tension. 17. Tight framing and close-ups are also commonly used. These can build tension and induce anxiety by not allowing the viewer to see beyond what is near the protagonist. 17. The interaction between horror films and their audiences is another significant issue discussed by Rhodes. He notes that horror films often serve as a safe space for viewers to confront and process their fears. This cathartic experience can provide psychological relief and a sense of empowerment as viewers face and overcome their anxieties in a controlled environment. The communal experience of watching horror films in theaters or discussing them in fan communities also plays a crucial role in the genre's impact and popularity. Charles Derry proposed that the three key components of horror are personality, Armageddon, and the demonic. In his book Dark Dreams, author Charles Derry conceived horror films as focusing on three broad themes: the horror of personality, the horror of Armageddon, and the horror of the demonic. 25. First, the horror of personality derives from monsters being at the center of the plot, such as Frankenstein's monster, whose psychology makes them perform horrific acts including rapes, mutilations, and sadistic killings. 25. Other key works with this theme include Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which feature psychotic murderers without monster makeup. 25. Second, the Armageddon theme explores the fear of large-scale destruction, which includes science fiction works, but also natural events, such as Hitchcock's The Birds, 1963. 25. Finally, the theme of the demonic features graphic accounts of satanic rites, witchcraft, and exorcisms outside traditional forms of worship, as seen in films such as The Exorcist, 1973, and The Omen, 1976. 26. Some critics have suggested that horror films can be vessels for exploring contemporary cultural, political, and social trends. Gene Hall, a film theorist, supports the use of horror films to ease the process of understanding issues by making use of their visual elements. 27. The use of horror films can help audiences to understand prior historical events. For example, the Vietnam War, the Holocaust, the worldwide AIDS epidemic. 28. Or post. 9/11 pessimism. 29. Anxiety surrounding race and racism have historically and continuously informed the horror genre. 2. A good example is the history of the zombie apocalypse subgenre. The first zombie horror films, such as White Zombie, 1932, were inspired by stories brought back to Europe by colonizers, and these stories explicitly presented Afro-Haitian religious and spiritual practices as evil and perverse. 30. The film which later revived the subgenre, Night of the Living Dead, 1968, incidentally presented themes surrounding race in America by casting Dwayne Jones, a black actor, as the lead. 31. Whether accidentally or actively. Horror films demonstrate societal issues. By who or what is chosen to incite fear, and how this choice is represented visually and narratively. Films before the 1930s, such as early German expressionist cinema and trick films, have been retrospectively described as horror films, since the genre did not become codified until the release of Dracula, 1931. Dracula was a box office success, leading Universal and several other American film studios to develop and popularize horror films well into the 1940s. By the 1950s, horror was often made with science fiction themes, and towards the end of the decade horror was a more common genre of international productions. The 1960s saw further developments, with material based on contemporary works instead of classic literature. The release of films such as Psycho, Black Sunday, and Night of the Living Dead led to an increase in violence and erotic scenes within the genre. The 1970s would expand on these themes with films that would delve into gorier pictures, as well as films that were near or direct pornographic hybrids. Genre cycles in this era include the natural horror film and the rise of slasher films, which expanded in the early 1980s. Towards the 1990s, postmodernism entered horror, while some of the biggest hits of the decade included films from Japan, such as the successful Ring, 1998. In the 21st century, streaming media popularized horror trends. These trends included torture porn influenced by the success of Saw, films using a found footage technique, and independent productions such as Get Out, Hereditary, and the Insidious series, which were box office hits. In discussing narrative trends in horror, scholar Isabel Pinedo draws on the book Monsters and Mad Scientists, A Cultural History of the Horror Movie, 1989, to map the development of the Anglo-American horror genre. She points out that early synchronized sound, as well as post-war period films, present threats to social order as external, while human agency, largely male, prevails. The focus is on the monster's acts of violence and the character's failed attempts at resistance, ending with male experts using violence or knowledge to defeat the monster and restore social order. 32-33. Pinedo presents the category of postmodern horror. She summarizes the narrative structure as indicating the prevalence of internal threats to social order by using a combination of monstrous violence and ineffectual human resistance, with open endings. These open endings may be as follows: the monster triumphs as in Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, 1990. The monster is defeated but only temporarily as in Halloween, 1978. Or there is an ambiguous outcome as in Night of the Living Dead, 1968, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, The Thing, 1982, and Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984. A genre that emerged in the 1970s, body horror films focus on the process of a bodily transformation. In these films, the body is either engulfed by some larger process or heading towards fragmentation and collapse. 35-36. The focus can be on apocalyptic implication of an entire society being overtaken, but the focus is generally upon an individual and their sense of identity, primarily them watching their own body change. 35. The earliest appearance of the subgenre was the work of director David Cronenberg, specifically with early films like Shivers, 1975. 35-36. Mark Jankovic of the University of Manchester declared that the transformation scenes in the genre provoke fear and repulsion, but also pleasure and excitement, such as in The Thing, 1982, and The Fly, 1986. 37. Christmas horror. Main article: Christmas horror. Christmas horror is a film subgenre that emerged in the 1970s with films such as Whoever Slew Auntie Roo, 1971, and Silent Night, Bloody Night, 1972, 38, which were soon followed by the influential Black Christmas, 1974. 38-39. Defining the Christmas horror genre has been described as challenging 40, as it has generally been regarded as a subgenre of the slasher film. 41-42. Adam Rockoff, in Room Work, noted that the subgenre sits within a trend of holiday-themed slasher films, alongside films such as My Bloody Valentine, 1981, and April Fool's Day, 1986. 42. Others take a broader view. That Christmas horror is not limited to the slasher genre, 41, noting how it evolved from the English Christmas tradition of telling ghost stories. 38. Christmas in literature has historically included elements of darkness, fright, misery, death, and decay, tracing its literary antecedents as far back as the biblical account of the Massacre of the Innocents and more recently in works such as E.T.A. Hoffman's The Nutcracker and the Mouse King 1816, and Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol 1843. 38. 39. Although ghosts have largely been replaced by serial killers, Christmas horror creates an outlet through which to explore a modern reinvention of the Christmas ghost story. 38. Erotic horror. Main article, Erotic horror. Erotic horror is a subgenre of horror fiction that blends sensual and sexual imagery with horrific themes for the sake of sexual arousal. Erotic horror has had influences on French 43 and American horror cinema. The works of Jean Rollin, such as Le Viol du Vampire and Fascination, are considered quintessential erotic horror films, blending deeply sexual imagery with gore. 43. American cinema has also featured notable erotic horror film franchises, such as Candyman. 44. An example of a British erotic horror film series is Hellraiser. 45. Alien features heavy erotic imagery, with the design of the Xenomorph by H.R. Geiger featuring both phallic and vaginal imagery, intended to symbolize patriarchal guilt. 46. As well as sex, rape, and pregnancy. 47. Extreme horror. Extreme horror is a subgenre of horror that emerged from early 20th century theater through shocking performances from Paris, France's Théâtre du Grand Guignol. 48. The transition from theater to cinema allowed transgressive acts of uncensored sex, torture, mutilation, and taboo exploitation to reach a wider audience. Notably, the 1970s heralded an extreme horror that is frequently cited as the beginning of the film subgenre, including Last House on the Left, 1972, Salo, or The 120 Days of Sodom, 1975, and I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. 49. Extreme horror film series, such as Saw 2004 and Hostel 2005, have reached mainstream media with characters' appearances in video games, namely Dead by Daylight, and the subject of musical lyrics for the band Ice Nine Kills. Folk horror. Main article, Folk horror. Folk horror uses elements of folklore or other religious and cultural beliefs to instill fear in audiences. Folk horror films have featured rural settings and themes of isolation, religion, and nature. 50-51. Frequently cited examples are Witchfinder General, 1968, The Blood on Satan's Claw, 1971, The Wicker Man, 1973, The Witch, 2015, and Midsummer, 2019. 50-51. Local folklore and beliefs have been noted as being prevalent in horror films from the Southeast Asia region, including Thailand and Indonesia. 52-53. Found footage horror. The found footage horror film technique gives the audience a first-person view of the events on screen and presents the footage as being discovered after. Horror films which are framed as being made up of found footage merge the experiences of the audience and characters, which may induce suspense, shock, and bafflement. 54. Alexandra Heller-Nicholas noted that the popularity of sites like YouTube in 2006 sparked a taste for amateur media, leading to the production of further films in the found footage horror genre later in the 2000s, including the particularly financially successful Paranormal Activity, 2007. 55. Gothic horror. Main article, Gothic film. In their book Gothic Film, Richard J. McCroy and Richard J. Hand stated that Gothic can be argued as a very loose subgenre of horror, but argued that Gothic, as a whole, was a style like film noir and not bound to certain cinematic elements like the Western or science fiction film. 56. The term Gothic is frequently used to describe a stylized approach to showcasing location, desire, and action in film. Contemporary views of the genre associate it with imagery of castles at hilltops and labyrinth-like ancestral mansions that are in various states of disrepair. 57. Narratives in these films often focus on an audience's fear and attraction to social change and rebellion. 58. The genre can be applied to films as early as The Haunted Castle, 1896, Frankenstein, 1910, as well as to more complex iterations such as Park Chan-wook Stoker, 2013, and Jordan Peele's Get Out, 2017. 56. The Gothic style is applied to several films throughout the history of the horror film. This includes Universal Pictures horror films of the 1930s, the revival of Gothic horror in the 1950s and 1960s with films from Hammer, Roger Corman's Pocycle, and several Italian productions. 59. By the 1970s, American and British productions often had vampire films set in a contemporary setting, such as Hammer films had their Dracula stories set in a modern setting and made other horror material, which pushed the erotic content of their vampire films that was initiated by Black Sunday. 60. 61-62. In the 1980s, the older horror characters of Dracula and Frankenstein's monster rarely appeared, with vampire-themed films continued often in the tradition of authors like Anne Rice, where vampirism becomes a lifestyle choice rather than plague or curse. 63. Following the release of Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992, a small wave of high-budgeted Gothic horror romance films were released in the 1990s. 64. Natural horror. See also, List of natural horror films. Also described as eco-horror, the natural horror film is a subgenre featuring nature running amok in the form of mutated beasts, carnivorous insects, and normally harmless animals or plants turned into cold-blooded killers. 65-66. In 1963, Alfred Hitchcock defined a new genre, nature taking revenge on humanity with the birds, 1963, that was expanded into a trend into the 1970s. Following the success of Willard, 1971, a film about killer rats, 1972 had similar films with Stanley, 1972, and an official sequel, Ben, 1972. 67. Other films followed in suit such as Night of the Lepus, 1972, Frogs, 1972, Bug, 1975, Squirm, 1976, and what Murie described as the turning point in the genre with Jaws, 1975, which became the highest-grossing film at that point and moved the animal attacks genres towards a less fantastic route, with less giant animals and more real life. Creatures such as Grizzly, 1976, and Night Creature, 1977, Orca, 1977, and Jaws 2, 1978. 67, 68, 69. The film is linked with the environmental movements that became more mainstream in the 1970s and early 1980s, such vegetarianism, animal rights movements, and organizations such as Greenpeace. 70. Following Jaws, sharks became the most popular animal of the genre, ranging from similar such as Mako, The Jaws of Death, 1976, and Great White, 1981, to the Sharknado film series. 70. James Marriott found that the genre had lost momentum since the 1970s while the films would still be made towards the turn of the millennium. 71. The slasher film is a horror subgenre which involves a killer murdering a group of people, often teenagers, usually by use of bladed tools. 76. In his book on the genre, author Adam Rockoff wrote that these villains represented a rogue genre of films that are tough, problematic, and fiercely individualistic. 77. Following the financial success of Friday the 13th, 1980, at least 20 other slasher films appeared in 1980 alone. 78. These films usually revolved around three properties: unique social settings, campgrounds, schools, holidays, and a crime from the past committed, an accidental drowning, infidelity, a scorned lover, and a ready-made group of victims, camp counselors, students, wedding parties. 79. The genre was derided by several contemporary film critics of the era such as Ebert, and often were highly profitable in the box office. 80. The release of Scream, 1996, led to a brief revival of the slasher films for the 1990s. 81. Other countries imitated the American slasher film revival, such as South Korea's early 2000 cycle with Bloody Beach, 2000, Nightmare, 2000, and The Record, 2000. Supernatural horror films, sometimes referred to as paranormal horror films, integrate supernatural elements, such as the afterlife, spirit possession, and religion into the horror genre. 84. Since they often focus on undead or non-physical beings, they may create unease in viewers without a visible presence on screen. This may include characters feeling a touch or chill in the air, furniture moving on its own, mysterious sounds, or lights flickering with no apparent cause. Prominent supernatural horror films include Paranormal Activity and The Conjuring. 85. Suburban Gothic is a subgenre of Gothic fiction, art, film, and television, focused on anxieties associated with the creation of suburban communities, particularly in the United States and the Western world. From the 1950s and 1960s onwards, teen horror is a horror subgenre that victimizes teenagers while usually promoting strong, anti-conformity teenage leads, appealing to young generations. This subgenre often depicts themes of sex, underage drinking, and gore. 89. Horror films aimed at a young audience, featuring teenage monsters, grew popular in the 1950s, with several productions from American International Pictures, AIP, and productions of Herman Cohen with I Was a Teenage Werewolf, 1957, and I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, 1957. 90. This led to later productions like Daughter of Dr. Jekyll, 1957, and Frankenstein's Daughter, 1958. 90. Teen horror cycle in the 1980s often showcased explicit gore and nudity, with John Kenneth Muir described as cautionary conservative tales where most of the films stated if you partook in such vices such as drugs or sex, your punishment of death would be handed out. 91. Prior to Scream, there were no popular teen horror films in the early 1990s. 92. After the financial success of Scream, teen horror films became increasingly reflexive and self-aware until the end of the 1990s with films like I Know What You Did Last Summer, 1997, and non-slasher The Faculty, 1998. 93-92. The genre lost prominence as teen films dealt with threats with more realism in films like Donnie Darko, 2001, and Crazy/Beautiful, 2001. 94. In her book on the 1990s teen horror cycle, Alexandra West described the general trend of these films is often looked down upon by critics, journals, and fans as being too glossy, trendy, and sleek to be considered worthwhile horror films. 95. Ian Olney described the horror films of Europe were often more erotic and just plain stranger than their British and American counterparts. 99. European horror films, generally referred to as Euro horror. 100. Draw from distinctly European cultural sources, including surrealism, romanticism, decadent tradition, early 20th century pulp literature, film serials, and erotic comics. 101. In comparison to the narrative logic in American genre films, these films focused on imagery, excessiveness, and the irrational. 102. Between the mid-1950s and the mid-1980s, European horror films emerged from countries like Italy, Spain, and France and were shown in the United States predominantly at drive-in theater and grindhouse theaters. 99. As producers and distributors all over the world were interested in horror films, regardless of their origin, changes started occurring in European low-budget filmmaking that allowed for productions in the 1960s and 1970s for horror films from Italy, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Spain, as well as co-productions between these countries. 103. Several productions, such as those in Italy, were co-productions due to the lack of international stars within the country. 104. European horror films began developing strong cult following since the late 1990s. 99. Oceania. Australia. It is unknown when Australia's cinema first horror title may have been, with thoughts ranging from The Strangler's Grip, 1912, to The Face at the Window, 1919, while stories featuring ghosts would appear in Gyra Ghost Mystery, 1921. 105. By 1913, the more prolific era of Australian cinema ended with production not returning with heavy input of government finance in the 1970s. 106. It took until the 1970s for Australia to develop sound film with television films that eventually received theatrical release with Dead Easy, 1970, and Night of Fear, 1973. The Cars That Ate Paris, 1974, was the first Australian horror production made for theatrical release. 105. 1970s Australian art cinema was funded by state film corporations, who considered them more culturally acceptable than local exploitation films, Ozploitation, which was part of the Australian phenomenon called the cultural cringe. 107. The greater success of genre films like Mad Max, 1979, The Last Wave, 1977, and Patrick, 1978, led to the Australian Film Commission to change its focus to being a more commercial operation. This closed in 1980 as its funding was abused by investors using them as tax-avoiding measures. A new development known as the 10BA tax shelter scheme was developed, ushering a slew of productions, leading to what Peter Shelley, author of Australian horror films, suggested meant making a profit was more important than making a good film. 107. Shelley called these films derivative of American films and presenting generic American material. 107. These films included the horror film productions of Anthony I. Ginnane. 108. While Australia would have success with international films between the mid-1980s and the 2000s, less than 5 horror films were produced in the country between 1993 and 2000. 109. 110. It was only after the success of Wolf Creek, 2005, that a new generation of filmmakers would continuously make horror genre films in Australia that continued into the 2010s. New Zealand. By 2005, New Zealand has produced around 190 feature films, with about 88% of them being made after 1976. 111. New Zealand horror film history was described by Philip Matthews of Stuff as making "pofaced gothic and now we do horror for laughs." 112. Among the earliest known New Zealand horror films productions are Strange Behaviour, 1981, a co-production with Australia, and Death Warmed Up, 1984, a single production. 113. Early features such as Melanie Reed's Trial Run, 1984, where a mother is sent to a remote cottage to photograph penguins and finds it habitat to haunted spirits, and Gayleen Preston's Mr. Wrong, 1984, purchases a car that is haunted by its previous owner. 114. Other films imitate American slasher and splatter films, with Bridge to Nowhere, 1986, and the early films of Peter Jackson, who combined splatter films with comedy with Bad Taste, 1988, and Brain Dead, 1992, which has the largest following of the mentioned films. 113. Film producer Ant Timpson had an influence curating New Zealand horror films, creating the incredibly strange film festival in the 1990s, and producing his own horror films over the 2010s, including The ABCs of Death, 2012, Deathgasm, 2015, and Housebound, 2014. 112. Timpson noted the latter horror entries from New Zealand are all humorous films like What We Do in the Shadows, 2014, with Jonathan King, director of Black Sheep, 2006, and The Tattooist, 2007, stating, "I'd love to see a genuinely scary New Zealand film, but I don't know if New Zealand audiences, or the funding bodies, are keen."